Paul, thank you for joining me on the Founders Predicament podcast.
Absolutely. Great.
And,
thanks for having me.
Of course. And my name's Ray Shah. I'm hosting the Founders Predicament. And I have with me Paul
DiCesare.
DiCesare. Okay, Paul DiCesare. Sorry about that.
No worries. It's a tough one.
Yeah. He's a Air Force veteran and an entrepreneur, and he's familiar with blockchain and familiar with real estate. And so that's where his focus currently lies. So Paul, tell me about how you got to where you are now, and tell me about, your career, up to now.
Sure. Yeah. So going back, I've been in the industry almost 20 years as far as real estate. I started off really when I got out of the Air Force in mortgage origination, and then when that industry kind of, did what it did, I got more into the sort of retail side of real estate, just being a real estate agent.
So hold on, let me stop you there for a second.
Yep.
So you got into the mortgage industry in 2004. Everybody
Correct.
knows what happened in 2008.
Correct.
So what happened from a personal perspective, from someone who was giving out mortgages, issuing mortgages, what happened from your personal?
Well, I saw the writing on the wall going back really probably 2 years prior to that. I don't have sort of traditional finance background, but I was smart enough to know, if you're overinflating mortgages and giving them to people that can't really afford them, what's going to happen. And I was seeing this in real time. I was never interested in, I consider myself a pretty moral person. I was never interested in, giving a fixed rate mortgage to a, 90-year-old woman. I was very disillusioned with the industry in general, but it was a good source of income, especially when you're, 25 years old. So I always sort of I wanted to get out of the industry, fairly quickly, even before the sort of bubble burst, or popped. So I wanted to get out of that. And once things started really falling apart, I had some money saved up. It wasn't like a ton of money, but I was able to sort of look at different options. And I'd always been sort of interested in, in software and, internet and just, there was no prop tech per se back then. There was really very little sort of SaaS, software as a service, that you kind of start on your own. There was none of this sort of, you could just build it quickly or anything like that. It was very challenging. So, I just kind of learned through my own sort of, processes and figuring it out and figure out what works and what doesn't. And I just had launched like a couple little things here and there, like sort of home evaluation for, green assessment, that sort of thing. Just some little things just to kind of get my feet wet in that industry, or in the sort of, SaaS sort of world, software as a service world. So that sort of springboarded me into getting more into prop tech and just kind of developing other companies as the years went on.
Okay, right.
Excuse me.
So property technology, you had an early startup in that space. Would you care to tell me about that? So
the first company I owned, that I sort of started off the ground, and I really had no idea what I was doing. It was a company, gosh, what was the name of it? It was called like Clear Green or something like that. This is years ago. This is like in 2006. And essentially what I did is I built this whole like model for real estate agents to go into properties, and sort of go through this sort of checklist process and sort of analyze the property to give them sort of what's like a lead score, meaning like building have lead scores, but it was a proprietary scoring system for residential properties. It wasn't really based on anything scientific. It was just kind of like, what's the age of their windows, what's the age of their doors, that sort of thing. So I had a guy I was working with at the time. This is years ago in Atlanta, and we sort of built out this product, and we would essentially not sell it, but have real estate agents pay us, $10 a month or something like that to use it. And then they can attach this green report that would spit out to sort of help attract to the property that they were trying to sell. That was sort of the business model.
Okay, that's interesting. And then later on, you had like a precursor to Airbnb?
Well, no. So, so back in 2000, so in 2011, I left it. Well, we moved to New York City. I moved to Brooklyn. Um, and I was, at that point, I was just kind of working as a real estate agent and just, like renting or selling apartments, renting apartments, that sort of thing. Worked for a number of companies there. But I was always kind of, thinking about what's next. So what I had done is I started a Airbnb property management company. So essentially what we would do is we would work with either individual like owners of the building, or they would be renters, or they would own the property, and we would manage that property for them. So we would do things like key check-ins or check-ins, key handoffs. We would clean the apartments. We would do linens, new towels, new sheets, that sort of thing. So on the tech side of that, we had built this whole sort of infrastructure system, because it's very, very complex to actually do this stuff. Because, New York obviously isn't like living out in the suburbs where everyone has a car. So there's a lot of like microtransactions that you have to figure out when people are landing. You have a lot of people coming from international. And at that point, Airbnb never had an API, and I don't even know if they do now. So in other words, you couldn't plug into their system. Even if you had the user's login, the host login, you still couldn't really coordinate with it. So we had to build this whole like proprietary system to kind of like essentially like sniff out when they were coming, and calendar. There was just a lot of data that we had to kind of figure out and then coordinate it. So it was a fairly sophisticated system that that we sort of had to just bootstrap, just kind of figure out on our own. So that's essentially what we were doing in New York.
So it came about after Airbnb, or?
Well, no, it was with, I mean, it was a service provider for Airbnb hosts. So it was,
Okay.
This was sort of early days for Airbnb. I mean, this was like, 2000. I mean, Airbnb was still a fairly big company at that point, but they were nothing what they are today. I mean, they were, tiny. I mean, people had still hadn't barely anyone had heard of Airbnb back in like 2011, 2012.
Yeah. Okay. So now your current endeavor is Sky VLS.
Correct.
But before we get into Sky VLS, let's go back. Just look back for a minute at the previous. It sounds like you had 2 or 3 startups before Sky VLS. So what would you do differently if you were starting again now? Say, pick any one of those and tell me what you would do differently.
So, back in like 2017, well, no, I'm sorry, it was a little bit after that. So I was really intrigued. This is actually in like 2018. Sorry, COVID just like, blew everything up, and I have no sense of like time anymore. So 2018. So I had a company called Blockstay. And essentially what it was is it was fractionalized real estate, sort of in a tokenized way, and which sounds complex, but essentially what we could do was go into buildings, break that building up into sort of tokenized pieces, and then we could sell those off. That was what we were attempting to do. So we had the whole ICO thing, initial coin offering. We went down that whole path. And this was actually sprung out of a different kind of company where it was very similar, just not using the sort of tokenized property. It was more of a traditional, fractionalized property product.
When you say fractionalized, you don't mean timeshare, I take it.
No. So timeshare is from the outside perspective, it looks fairly similar, but it's much different because you're much more locked in, and you're it's much more difficult to sell, and it's a whole different thing. It's it's old school for lack of a better term. Fractionalized property is basically like, it's similar to a REIT, except you're actually investing in a specific property. So it could be it mainly focuses on residential, so it's more vacation property. It could be well, it doesn't have to be a vacation property, but it could be anything from a property where you want to actually go there and stay 2 weeks a year, or it could be something that's just pure investment. It could be something you never even see, but it has, you know, a high ROI, or something like that. So essentially, you go in, you buy it up. Yeah, go ahead.
How does the ROI work with fractionalized property?
Well, so essentially that, you know, just through data analytics, they basically can analyze the area, figure out what the actual, you know, return on investment would be for that particular property, just historical data. I mean, post-COVID, everything's just gone completely insane. And that's why you have companies like BlackRock and these, you know, huge investment, you know, $100 trillion companies coming in and buying up, you know, single family homes. Which, you know, is crazy to me because, I mean, 10 years ago, they could care less. So essentially, they can look at historical data, whether or not that matters or not, and essentially can say, okay, over the next 10 years on your 1/8 of this property, 1/20th property, whatever it is, whatever the creator of that sort of process comes up with, they can essentially come up with sort of a historical sort of return on investment of whatever that property is, including whatever rental income can come out of that as well.
So I put, say, $10,000 in a $100,000 property. Over 10 years, the property value goes to, let's say, just to make the math simple.
Yeah, sure.
200,000. And then the property is realizing, let's say, 25,000 a year in rental income.
Correct.
Right. So then, but obviously, let's say that's net after expenses, like taxes and stuff. So I get $25,000 a year as my share of the net rent.
Right. Yeah.
And then I get
after expenses.
After expenses, and then I get at the end, like after 10 years, I decide to liquidate my estate, and the assessed value has doubled. So I get, for the $10,000 initial investment, I get $20,000. Is that correct?
Correct. For all intents and purposes, correct.
I mean, that can work both ways, right? Because the value of the property could go down. You know, the neighborhood, somebody might build a garbage incinerator next door or something.
Yeah,
like
exactly. But from my experience, it typically doesn't. I mean, it could, of course it could, but it typically doesn't, because these properties are so like hand-picked, and the demand is so high, and there's so many, you know, people that want to get involved in real estate, but they don't have, you know, 50 grand or whatever it is just to plunk down on a single property, nor do they want to do the maintenance or the the upkeep, or the tenant sort of, you know, issues or whatever it may be. This is a good way for them to sort of just, you know, they may not over the course of, you know, 5-10 years, you know, clear 200 grand, but still, if they are smart, they can, you know, basically go in and, you know, over 5 or 6 different properties and still make a decent return. So yeah, I think it's a good way to sort of hedge against you know, owning a single property, and then, you know, something happens, and then, you know, you're kind of out of luck.
Right. So what happened? Why are you not still doing that? What changed? So I know COVID, but how did that
as far as on the tokenized real estate?
Yeah.
So a couple things. So it's, in hindsight, I ask myself that quite a bit sometimes. In hindsight, it's kind of silly, because and this is the honest God truth, I was really these were really early days for crypto, and I was really freaked out about, you know, getting in trouble, to be honest, because there really was, I mean, there still is barely any legislation around this stuff, but I mean, if you look anything at the crypto landscape now, I mean, all these companies, I mean, you know, SBF is a prime example, but that's a whole different thing. But you know, most of these companies now that have been sort of facilitators of crypto, founders, are all under some sort of federal investigation. I was worried about that back then. I had a really legal, a friend of mine who's a lawyer, and he had a sort of team around him that was helping us to make sure that we, you know, we're doing everything on the up and up, but still it was like I was really concerned about getting in trouble. Essentially, I didn't want any any of the FTC stuff that I was seeing sort of happening low key back then compared to now. But I was just sort of concerned about that at the time. I had a 3-year-old, 2-year-old, and I just didn't really want that sort of heat on me, to be completely honest. So I mean, in hindsight, I think it's silly because just what's actually happened in the 5 years since then. These millions of dollars and just kind of ran away. So part of me is like, man, if I only made $1 billion and ran away, but I mean, I'm kidding. Well, partially kidding.
No, but how did you divest yourself from that company? Did you just wind the whole thing down, or would you?
We just wound it down. I mean, essentially, we had built part of the platform out. We sort of had a beta. We had a beta product. It worked, but it was nothing that was really ready to scale or anything like that. So, it's just like like startups do, some work, some don't. I think we did as much due diligence as we possibly could. I think that the product that we had, I think, was really good for the time that we were in. But it was just one of those things where I was just hitting a wall, and the whole ICO thing just kind of came crashing down too, where we had raised some capital up front just through traditional methods to try to get us to to the sort of ICO phase to where we can do like a coin launch, but it was becoming really difficult to do that. And so we actually never did the actual coin launch. And so it just wasn't going to work. It came down to that.
So what would you, if you were doing it again now? I mean, I still think it still sounds like a good idea. I don't know how the competitive landscape has changed. Presumably it's changed quite a bit in that time. But if you were doing it again now, what would you do differently from what you did then?
In regards to that specific company,
the fractionalized property.
I don't think it right now. Now this could change in 2-3 years from now, but right now, if I was to start it again, I wouldn't have a blockchain component to that, because there's the companies that have the fractionalized side to them. There's a number out there. There's a number of them out there that are actually very successful, that have raised that are valued at hundreds of millions of dollars, and that are essentially that's their model, and they have no sort of blockchain component to them. They're just fractionalized. They figured out the formula. They market the hell out of themselves. And they know what they're doing. They're very good. They're very professional. So I would just focus on traditional fractionalized real estate, if that's a thing, and just be innovative in that space, but don't be overly innovative like I think that we sort of were.
Yeah, I've been ahead of the market before. And it's just as bad as being behind the market, if not worse.
Exactly. I mean, what's the adage about the West is paved with, I forget what it is. I mean, it's very hard to be a trailblazer, in other words.
Yeah, and it can, you spend a lot of time spinning your wheels explaining the concept over and over again to people.
Exactly. You're making my point better than I am.
Okay, excellent. So what led you to Sky VLS.
Yeah.
And what problem are you solving?
Sure. So Sky VLS was, I've even after Blockstay, I still was very much interested in this sort of crypto Web3. They weren't really calling it Web3 back then, but sort of evolved into Web3. Just this side of the sort of tech space. I mean, that's really where I've just been interested in this for years at this point. So I and some other people that I consult with, we were just kind of looking at what are sort of some other options we can kind of keep in this space. I didn't really want to have another tokenized business per se, where we had a token, something like that. I wanted to keep away from that. And so we were looking at could we do something in the metaverse? Was there a crossover with the real sort of physical world? What were these different options that we could look at with my sort of background in physical real estate, and in this sort of virtual space? So and this was going back really to last year when, the metaverse thing really was getting like super hyped up and, really frothy. I mean, to a point where it was kind of getting silly, I think, but I was never interested in that. That wasn't really ever my thing. I really was looking at this from a more practical, almost boring side, where I wanted to really work with like commercial real estate developers, and that had existing properties, essentially come in, look at their property, say, hey, we can essentially digitize this property, and then you can own this property in a digital format. It can be on the blockchain, because I think that will protect you if someone wants to come through, because if you have this valuable property, that may not be as famous as, like, let's say, One World Trade, or the Empire State Building, but it's like Cooper Union. I always use that as an example. So if you've never lived in New York or been to New York, Cooper Union is a very famous building, sort of in Lower Manhattan. If you see it, you kind of recognize it, but you wouldn't know what it is. So in other words, if you own that building, maybe you want to create that as a digital, in a digital format, so that you can have that as a digital representation, and you can own that, essentially own that IP, put it on the blockchain, or have it on the blockchain saying, this is mine, I own it. And then when someone else comes and purchases that property, you can essentially transfer that digital ownership to them. So having it.
Sorry,
go ahead.
Is this like a non-fungible token, an NFT, or is it not?
Correct. So it creates an NFT out of that property. So you essentially you will create an NFT of that property, and you can basically interact with that property, and you can own that property. And then you can, if you want to get creative, you can sell off different pieces inside of that property in a digital sense. Like, I've been discussing with people, like, you could have a piece of that in Decentraland, something like that. You could hold events in it, things of that nature. If you're a developer, let's say you have a building in Miami that you're putting up, a condo, you could have one of these units that you can showcase to an international buyer. And then when they purchase that property, you can essentially attach that NFT to that physical property as, as sort of a perk that they can then, use for their purposes. And then they can essentially transfer that off when they sell the property, if that's something that they want to do. So it adds value to the property, even if they don't necessarily use it, for a fairly low amount of money, to just create this digital representation.
So explain to me how it adds value. I know that if I paint my apartment, I'm adding value. How does building an NFT of my apartment add value to the physical property?
Sure. So, like I said, in one way, if you are interested in doing, some kind of virtual event, if that's your thing, then that would be one way. It's not for everyone, understood. But from a practical standpoint, excuse me, if you're trying, let's say you're trying to, you're thinking about selling your apartment, okay? Just as a personal owner, you're thinking about selling your apartment. And even before it goes on the market, okay, you have this really high quality, interactive model of your space that you own. It's yours. You can let's say you want to just get some feedback from people that say, hey, I'm thinking of selling my space, take a look at this. They can interact with it, they can look at it, say, this looks great, maybe you should improve this, or something like that. It's just a feedback mechanism for your space. Or you could essentially transfer that. You could make a copy of that to a real estate agent, say, I'm thinking of selling my property. And this is just one example. This could be one individual owner, but this could also be an entire developer. But for the one owner example, they could essentially, send this over to an agent that they're working with, right. Say, hey, this is what I'm thinking of selling, give me some feedback. What do you think we can get? It's much quicker. It's much faster, than having the agent come to your house, look around, sniff around, that sort of thing.
Yeah, so I understand that. Why does it have to be an NFT? What's the advantage of that, as opposed to just a regular 3D model that you can walk through?
Well, so our platform set up to accept an NFT. Okay, that's how our platform works. Okay. It doesn't. But the thing is, anyone can, if you mint that as an NFT and someone then comes along and then does the exact same thing, you can say, look, I was the first, I essentially have ownership of this, right? I'm the one that, you have proof that you're the first owner of that
Yeah.
property, essentially.
Okay, but in New York and Miami and other places where large high rises or even low rises are built, you have a line, and in that line, every apartment's pretty much identical. So once you've done the model for one, like say, I live in 53, but the person from 63, 33, or 43 could use the same 3D model,
Right.
and show their apartment, and the differences would be minimal, or zero.
I totally agree. I'm not disagreeing with that. And again, I don't think this would work for every single property. What I would say is, from sort of a holistic view, is that particular that particular example probably wouldn't work, but from a developer standpoint, it could work, because instead of having one individual unit, the developer could essentially have an NFT of the entire building and then showcase each individual property, each individual unit, even though they are similar. And then they could say, okay, this is, unit 11R, unit 11B. I know they look similar, but you could essentially own this one.
Oh, I see. Okay. So I know you're just getting started and you haven't really got users yet, but what's your pitch? And then also, what's your pitch to investors?
Sure. So for the individual user, it's basically what I've been saying. We can create a digital representation of your property if that's something that you're interested in. Again, it's still a pretty focused product. It's still a pretty focused, unique product. This isn't, I never created this to sort of be this, like, I don't think this is going to be in, every single home, essentially, because it's just not, it's still a pretty niche thing. But with this, there's a lot of different areas you can go into this. So especially with the sort of generative AI, where we can essentially create buildings and units on the fly. Essentially, if we're creating the model that essentially, if I say I want to create a Miami condo, whatever the generative AI model that we plug in, we can essentially self-generate that building, and then we can essentially sell that off to different developers to say, hey, this is something that we can get, and it's not this sort of wacky sort of AI futuristic. I mean, what I've seen and what I've worked with a few people. I mean, the stuff that we can actually create is extremely high level. Extremely realistic. So essentially, we can create these buildings that are immutable. In other words, this is my building, and we can sell that off to them. Now, they don't necessarily have to use it, but essentially, they can take pieces of it and things of that nature. So we're using it sort of as a modeling sort of example, or they can use it if they want to get involved in gaming. They can do that. They can use it as a sort of a gaming apparatus, something to that level, where different need assets, and then we have sort of these assets on demand that they can use. We also have a renting model. So if you want to just use it for a short amount of time, you can use it as a short amount of time. We're collecting a fee, the developer's collecting most of that fee. So they can. There's a lot of flexibility in the space.
So okay, so that's from the and what sort of money are you talking about for say renting a big space like like what was the property downtown you talked about?
Like Cooper Union,
right?
Yeah, go ahead.
So if I wanted to rent out Cooper Union for 5 hours on a Friday night, then how would that look?
You're saying in like Decentraland or something like that?
Yeah.
I mean, it's not going to be, I'd love to say it's going to be $2 million. It's probably 100, 200, $300, something like that. I mean, it really depends on how many users are going to be involved. I mean, if it's going to be something, you know, where there's just going to be like two individual users, it's probably not going to be that much. But if it's something like a virtual event that's hosted by a name brand company like Prada or something like that, you know, they're pretty involved in the space. You know, it could be thousands of dollars. Who knows?
Right. So, and then
It's just tough. It's tough to gauge.
Yeah. How do you play? Do you plug and play with other platforms?
It's can you
So if I'm, you know, a Facebook user, can I like and somebody?
No, because those are all they call it. They're really Web 2. The Web 3 just means, you know, it's more. Let me back up. So Facebook, you know, their metaverse, you know, Roblox, you know, their metaverse. Those are all like closed off systems. You can't. You could essentially develop in those spaces, but from like the Web3 sort of community, most are, just because Meta is going to take, you know, 80% of your revenue essentially,
Right.
and you never know if they're going to pull the plug, basically.
Right. So what other platforms do you play with?
So mainly Decentraland. I mean, I think that's the biggest one. There's a couple other ones, Vlox, and then what is the other one? I mean, it's mainly Decentraland. That's pretty much the mainstay of what we're sort of creating the assets in.
Right, and then you were going to tell me, just briefly, give me the investor pitch in, you know, a few minutes if you can.
Yeah, sure. So so as far as what we're mainly focused on is the real estate industry. So our pitch, we're mainly targeting, you know, investors in the real estate space, right? So our pitch to them is for, you know, this may not be the cleanest pitch, but essentially, you know, they're very deep pocketed and they're losing, you know, a lot of money right now in the commercial real estate space because, you know, just with the way that the market has shifted, right?
The world's turned on its head.
The world is just completely changed, right? I mean, these buildings are being sold off pennies on the dollar. My pitch is this: for the cost of you guys putting curtains in a new office, essentially we can create a new way for you to interact with more customers. Now, I can't guarantee that it's going to fill up, you know, your tower, but even if it brings you in a few more tenants because they saw this as a digital format, and it just gives you more, it gives you more options as far as trying to lease your buildings, and trying to get in, trying to interact with a new customer base, typically a younger customer base, people that are trying to try to figure out, maybe I don't want, you know, do I want to bring my office into this space? Do I want to bring my office in this space? And this just gives you an advantage against developers or owners that aren't using this technology.
Right. Okay. Perfect. Okay, great. So was there anything else? So, you know, my last question is generally, you know, if you were giving advice to someone who's just about to leave their job, they're just about to break free and take their idea on the road, you know, and make that their career, you know, the startup entrepreneur, the classic startup entrepreneur, what advice would you give them?
Stay at your job. No, I'm just kidding. No, I'm just kidding. My advice is, you know, absolutely have a plan. I mean, I know it's always, you know, very tempting to, you know, sort of break out and, you know, do your own thing. And it can be really rewarding. But, you know, have a plan and really try to find people, you know, that you can work with that are going to bring your sort of ideas and, you know, especially in the tech space, you know, your sort of vision into reality, because the last thing that you want to do is, you know, write a check to you know, a development team that either doesn't know what they're doing or you know, isn't that interested in the project, and all of a sudden, you know, calls aren't returned and, you know, Slack chats aren't returned and things of that nature. You know, you got to really trust the people that you're working with, and you know, just have a plan, you know, find good people, and you know, you just it's a long process, but yeah, that's my advice.
Okay, well, Paul, thank you so much for joining me on the Founders
Absolutely.
Predicament.
Thanks so much for having me.
let's touch base again soon.
Yeah, sounds great.
Okay, take care.
Thank you.
Bye bye.